Good morning and welcome to the Sages presentation of A History of St. Peter Catholic Church, Part 1. I'm Louise Rice and I'm chair of the Sages Ministry. Before I go any further this morning, I want to mention just yesterday the passing of a very special sage, Barney Offerman, and want to say to Jan and her family that our prayers and thoughts and love are with you. Now, I'm here to introduce and thank Tony Bucci and Joe Breen, creators and presenters of this wonderful program. They've worked for months and many, many hours to bring this to Sages and to the parish. They were assisted by Joan Guthrie and her assistant, Liz Agan. And of course, Susie Long, our Sages Communications Chair, and Jean Katz, as you just saw, as Zoom technical director. Thank you, Jean. So grateful to Tony and Joe and all the folks involved in this production. And that includes some special cameo appearances by Ray Ferris, Abbott Placid Solari, Gail Graham, and Jim and Mary Lou Babb. Also, Father Shea, my thanks for your continued encouragement and support for Sages. We are in our third year despite COVID. I also want to thank all you Sages for your enthusiastic participation. And I encourage you to look forward to more events, hopefully in person at some point in time. And now I'm turning the program over to Tony Bucci. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Good morning, everyone. And I want to express my thanks for your being here as well. You should have the opening slide on your screens. And you can see the title of this presentation. And you see that it is the first part one of the history of St. Peter Catholic Church. And then there'll be a part 2 sometime later in the spring. This history, like all history, is imperfect. And the resources that we used were, in many cases, imperfect or incomplete, or up until a certain point of time where we or someone else found them non-existent. So we've drawn on many, many resources for this. The history is going to be presented largely in chronological order, not perfectly in chronological order, but largely. Now, I want to say something about the title. You know that all of our previous programs have been about harvesting and sharing our wisdom. And one might ask, how does one harvest and share wisdom through sharing our history? Well, for an answer to that, I want to turn to an expert. So if you would take a moment and look at this, I am going to read it out loud, even though that's typically not something that's done when you're doing this kind of presentation, but I think the words are so important, I want us to be able to hear them as well as read them. The elders are the historical memory of every community, a patrimony of wisdom and faith that needs to be heard, cared for, and valued. They have wisdom, life's wisdom, history's wisdom, the homeland's wisdom, the family's wisdom, and we need all this. So as part of this, we're going to ask God for the grace to share our wisdom. And I'm going to ask Joe Breen to help us reflect on that.
This is from the 92nd Psalm. The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him.
Thank you, Joe. We're going to hear periodically from, as mentioned, from some fellow sages, and they'll be giving testimony, if you will, as they reflect on their very lengthy connections with St. Peter. Sorry.
My great-grandfather was a member, and then my grandfather was a member of St. Peter's. My mother was a member of St. Peter's, and later on, I became a member of St. Peter's. St. Peter's was the beginning of Catholicism in Charlotte.
Bishop John Carroll, he was the first bishop of the first diocese, the Diocese of Baltimore, which was established in 1789 and encompassed all of the original 13 states. John was a Jesuit priest, and he founded the esteemed Georgetown University, the first Catholic university in the United States. He was the cousin of an even more esteemed Charles Carroll, a founding father and the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence.
John England. John England was the first bishop of the Diocese of Charleston. And you can see he was named bishop, consecrated as bishop while he was still in Ireland. And then he arrives in Charleston in December of 1820. And the Diocese of Charleston is the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. This is the sixth U.S. diocese at this point in the country. And the diocese included mostly poor immigrant laborers from Ireland, and it included refugees from Santo Domingo, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, plus any people that refugees or immigrants might have brought with them. England is noted for 12 years of solid leadership for the diocese. He brought nuns to teach in Charleston and to care for victims of cholera and yellow fever, both of which were common in the area. He opened, at least for a while, free schools for Black children, and periodically on Sundays, he would preach in a church that we know very, very well now across the country, and that is the Mother Emanuel Church, which was founded in 1816. So he preached in that Black church. You can see the number of Catholics across the diocese, across those three states, only 11,000 Catholics.
This is a sulky, as you can see. And around 1830, a missionary, a Father J.T. Cronin, visited Catholics along the road from Charleston to Charlotte in a sulky just like this. He was just one of a whole number of missionaries who traveled to administer the sacraments to this people who were spread throughout this area. It was 300 miles of bad road and a bad ride, as you can see from this. Even by stagecoach, it took 3 days. These days, the trip on I-77 or 26 takes about 3 hours, particularly if you're Tony Bucci with a heavy foot.
And you can see the 30-mile circuits that are mentioned. When Cronin and other missionaries traveled to those towns, they went to those towns, it became a base, and then they did a 30-mile circuit with that as the center of the spokes and the wheel. So a lot of overlapping if you were to see this on a map. Now, Jean had mentioned that there would be times during the presentation where we would ask you about whether or not you recognized something. So this is the first time. How many of you believe you know what this is a picture of? And if you think you know, raise your hand. I'm going to give folks a minute. Well, out of all the participants that we have, so far we have only about 4 who have raised their hands. Well, let's find out what this is.
Which has the oldest standing Catholic church in North Carolina in its original form, St. Joseph's. As you may know, commercial gold mining in the United States began in this area around Charlotte. And there was a community of Irish Catholic miners there at Cowan's Ford who built St. Joseph's Church, wooden frame structure that still exists on Highway 7, going through Mount Holly. That was a stop for Father Jeremiah as he would visit periodically to witness marriages, baptize children, celebrate Mass, hear confessions, and so.
Okay, here are current pictures, relatively current pictures of St. Joseph Church. It was originally named St. Mary and St. Joseph, and then was shortened to St. Joseph's. You can see that depending upon the angle, it may sometimes look like a church and other times looks like it might be a home. You can also see the 2 historical markers. The one on the upper left is one of the roadside markers that you see throughout the state, and the other is on the site. You can also see that there is a small cemetery on the grounds of St. Joseph Church. This is on the National Register of Historic Places, and you see that it was dedicated by Bishop I.A. Reynolds. That's Ignatius Reynolds, who was then at that time the Bishop of the Diocese of Charleston. And it is and remains the oldest standing Catholic church in the state of North Carolina. Now, you saw Abbot Solari, and if any of us know anything about the history of St. Peter's, we know that it was a Benedictine church for a long time, for most of its history. So just a couple of things quickly about the Order of St. Benedict, or commonly known as the Benedictines. There's the man himself, okay, the founder of the order. And if you noticed in the video with Abbot Solari, there was a painting of Benedict on the wall behind him. Similar to this, a lot of the paintings about him are similar, so we have really a general idea of what he probably looked like. The Benedictines have a motto, ora et labora, and that means pray and work. And then there is the rule of Saint Benedict that guides all of the decisions that and actions that the Benedictines take. And that is this. Now that may have a familiar ring to some of you because if you think of the Jesuit motto, ad maiorem Dei gloriam, all things for the glory of God. And this is that in all things God may be glorified. So there's an interesting relationship between the focus of the two orders. Let's hear from the abbot again. Oops.
The Benedictines have played a role in the life of St. Peter's, but perhaps even more importantly, St. Peter's Church played a role in the Benedictines coming to North Carolina. As there were two brothers by the name of O'Connell, Lawrence and Jeremiah. Lawrence was pastor at St. Peter's in the 1870s. His brother Jeremiah, I believe they were both, or Jeremiah at least, was a priest of the Charleston, South Carolina diocese. There was no organized diocese in North Carolina. And my understanding is St. Peter's in Charlotte was initially founded as a mission from St. Peter's in Columbia.
Well, you heard him earlier talk about Father Jeremiah, and this is the man that you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next few minutes, and Joe is going to begin by telling you about Father Jeremiah O'Connell.
Think of Father Jeremiah as the founding father of St. Peter. He really was. A little background on him. He immigrated from County Cork in Ireland. He was ordained as a priest in 1844 in Charleston. And he visited Charlotte for the first time in 1850. At that point, the city was just a small remote burg without even a railroad connection. There are only 3 brick buildings. One was an old Episcopal church where he preached from time to time. Some said he did pretty well. O'Connell purchased a 2-acre lot for $500 from the Lonergan family, a local clan who'd been around for a long time. Much of the money was contributed by local Protestants who were particularly impressed by his preaching, so we hear. He was also instrumental in purchasing 500 acres for Belmont Abbey. Evidently, he did that for $10. So even then, real estate was cheaper out in the burbs.
Now, the founding father has the lot, and now he has enough money left over to build the church. So the lot cost $500, and the church is going to cost approximately $500. You know, we don't have any photographs of the church. 1851 photography is still quite in its infancy, and given the way Joe had described the town, it's likely that there weren't any photographers around, but we did have people who could sketch the church. There are 2 that we have found. This is one, and then you'll see another one later. So if Father O'Connell, Jeremiah O'Connell, said in his the history that he wrote called Catholicity in the Carolinas and Georgia, when he describes the building of St. Peter, he talks about how he searched for mechanics in masonry. In other words, he was looking for skilled craftsmen. He wanted to build a brick church. And these folks that you see here were in fact those mechanics in masonry. Patrick Hardy was well known in the small town and was considered a master craftsman. You see 2 Lonergan groups. Edward and James Lonergan were brothers, and William and James Lonergan were their nephews conjointly. In other words, they were the sons of another Lonergan brother Edward and James. If you want to have a conversation with either Patrick Hardy or the Lonergans, you can visit Elmwood Cemetery downtown to speak and visit with Patrick Hardy. You can see his small mausoleum behind the iron gates in that cemetery, and the Lonergans are buried in the cemetery at St. Joseph Church. Now, it's raising hand time again. This is on the right, the original cornerstone of the 1851 church. And the question is, how many of you know where this is currently held and displayed? Okay, well, we have about 5-6 times the response we had to the first question. So if you know that, most of you do not, it is embedded in the sidewalk in front of St. Peter Church, about 10 to 12 feet from the bottom of the steps in the front entrance. So if you've never really noticed that before, the next time you visit church or attend church, this is something that you might want to look at. It was laid by Father O'Connell, Jeremiah O'Connell, and blessed by him on, I'm sure you'll guess this, day of significance, St. Patrick's Day in 1851. Now, we are also very fortunate. He preached at the laying of the cornerstone. And from his history, you know, it was a pretty decent sized crowd coming to hear him and to view the laying of the cornerstone. We are extremely fortunate because we found buried deep in the archives a live recording of his talking about the dedication of the cornerstone.
I laid the cornerstone of the church in Charlotte. It is a rough gray granite block without any memorials, civil or ecclesiastical. And visible at the northeast corner of the edifice, I preached 2 hours on the infallibility of the church. None left the assemblage.
So he with great humility, talked about how people listened to him speak for 2 hours on the infallibility of the church, and nobody left.
Well, let me just make a point about that, because I can't imagine those Protestants who thought he was such a great preacher really appreciated the infallibility of the Catholic Church.
Indeed. But from that dedication, for 90 years, Charlotte was the only, St. Peter was the only Catholic church in Charlotte. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a minute, 90 years brings it to 1941. What about St. Patrick? Well, we'll get to that later in terms of the relationship of St. Patrick to St. Peter in the early days.
So here is that a drawing of that first church. Its dimensions were 56 feet by 34 feet. It had an arched ceiling. The 4 walls were constructed by, as Tony mentioned, Patrick Hardy, Edward and James Lonergan, and their nephews, William and James. One wall and the foundation were badly damaged during an arsenal explosion at the end of the Civil War. That installation, that arsenal, was on a site which is now on Stonewall Street, probably around where that gas station was. We should remember that before they tore it down.
Now, there's also, we found that while records are very, very sparse or non-existent in the early years of the church, Father Jeremiah O'Connell actually kept some handwritten notes about marriages that he performed over a period of 4 years. Apparently it was, once a year he would perform marriages, because remember, he's never the permanent pastor of St. Peter. He was the builder of St. Peter. He was the founder of St. Peter, and he would continue to ride the circuit and return to St. Peter at least annually. You can maybe read some of this, but to help with just looking more closely at that piece of paper, you can see in the center the bolder writing. On October 21st of 1851, he witnessed the marriage vows of Milton A. Smith and Miss Norma Cahill. And a little bit of that is kind of illegible, but he talks about the witnesses were Charles Duffy and Miss S. Kelly. Apparently, she didn't have a first name, only an initial. So now Charles Duffy must have been a professional witness, because you can see that he is, he's also up here, okay? And if you were to see the rest of it down here, you'd see that he was a witness again. So apparently that was his role in St. Peter's. Now, yes, your screen is black, so there's nothing wrong with what you're viewing. The history of St. Peter that we know, and some of the brief histories that we read, they paint a very positive picture of, St. Peter's place in the city of Charlotte throughout history. But St. Peter also had at least two pretty dark periods in its history. And this is one of those dark periods. If you look at these data, slaves were 39% of the population, which by my imperfect math means that the entire population of Charlotte was somewhere between 11 and 12,000. And you had maybe a little more than that, but slaves, 5,500, were a significant part of the population. And contrary to the stereotype, which is always showing slaves working in the fields in agriculture, in Charlotte, they not only, in Mecklenburg, they not only worked in agriculture, but also in mining and in construction. If you were to look at any surviving photographs of miners, you'd note that you could identify some of the workers as Black, and therefore they were slaves. Now, on the right-hand side, you notice that there's a bit of a hedge there. We do not know with absolute certainty that slaves were involved in the building of the church. We do know it is highly likely that they were involved in the building of the church. And we could not rely on diocesan records or church records because there's no level of detail relative to slavery or the role of Blacks in the history of St. Peter. We do know that Edward Lonergan was a slaveholder. We know that Patrick Hardy was a slaveholder. And when Joe talked about their constructing the church, each of those, the two Lonergans, Patrick Hardy was responsible for one wall, Edward Lonergan for another, his brother for another, and then the two nephews for the fourth. Well, remember, they didn't do this by themselves. They had crews, and while some histories denote that a man who was a German immigrant carried the brick, there's no other mention of anyone else who worked on it, but one can be fairly confident that because these men were slaveholders, that their slaves were working alongside them. William McKenna, you haven't heard that name before to date, but he was a slaveholder, and he was probably the wealthiest member of St. Peter Church, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. Bishops were slaveholders. Bishop John England had a slave. Bishop Ignatius Reynolds had 5. And Bishop Patrick Lynch, who succeeded Reynolds, had about somewhere between 5 and 10 slaves, can't be absolutely positive. So like many of the people of the South at that time, even the clergy, were slaveholders. Now, Bishop Patrick Lynch has an interesting side story that's related to William McKenna, who identified as among the wealthiest members of the church. McKenna died in 1861, and in his will, he left his farm, which was in Lancaster County. So then, like today, people came to St. Peter from the greater metro area, if you will. And he, before he died, he was so wealthy that by himself, he donated 10% of the money used to purchase the church and to build it. Now think about that. 10% was $100. And that was the largest donation that was received. But in his will, he leaves his farm and 85 slaves to the Diocese of Charleston. And if he had 85 slaves, that wasn't your small independent farmer. He was a huge plantation owner and a Roman Catholic who saw apparently nothing wrong with holding slaves. So the diocese inherits this farm and these slaves from McKenna, and in his will, he specifies that the slaves are to be sold at the discretion of the diocese, but for the purpose of building churches and schools throughout the diocese. Patrick Lynch, we understand, took possession of the slaves and the land, but left the slaves on the plantation. He did not sell them. And it appears the reason he did not sell them was because he realized that many of those slaves were family members, and he had no interest in breaking up families. So they were never sold, but they remained on the property until ultimately they were freed. There were also slaveholding clergy. Of the 10 missionaries that we have documentation of working in the Carolinas, the only evidence of slaveholding was by Jeremiah O'Connell. So the father of St. Peter, the founding father of St. Peter, like the founding father of the United States, were both slaveholders. He had one slave, but he had a slave.
Well, here we are back to the church. Bishop Ignatius Reynolds dedicated the church in 1852. Tony just mentioned Bishop Reynolds. There were about 100 Catholics in Charlotte at that time, and St. Peter was near the heart of the city. So Father Lawrence O'Connell was a brother of Jeremiah. He became the first pastor in 1853 and served until 55, and then on several stints afterwards, in and out. During the war, Reverend J.D. O'Connell served as pastor. He was another brother or cousin. So we just wonder who was tending the farm in Ireland. So he ministered to the many injured Confederate soldiers during the war years. At the time, there were no permanent pastors. Frequently, parishioners led the worship, and some of these names you could recognize: Foxes, Sandlers, Caldwells, Alexanders, Spurgs. So recognize them, and recognize that some of them have streets in the area named after them. Father Lawrence O'Connell returned as pastor after serving as a chaplain in the Confederate Army. He came back in 1873. He had been achieved a rank of major. You may wonder whether an elephant is really buried around here. Perhaps, but no, there's a story behind this. The John Robinson Circus came to town in 1880 with much excitement. You can imagine the excitement that a circus would bring to this backwater town with nothing really happening. Unfortunately, the animal trainer, John King, was crushed by a neurotic elephant named Chief. Don't know why his name Chief. Perhaps he was wearing feathers. I don't know. So a funeral mass was celebrated at St. Peter, and the burial was at Elmwood Cemetery on West 6th Street. And the pastor, Father Lawrence O'Connell, officiated at that. Chief the elephant led a long life and died of peanut overdose.
The circus performers also paraded after the coffin down Tryon Street and over to the cemetery, following the coffin of John King from St. Peter. Now, most of us know that the Sisters of Mercy have had a relationship with St. Peter Church. This gives you a quick look at some of the key moments of their role, not only in Charlotte, but particularly in St. Peter's. They came from Ireland in 1843 for the first time. Around 1887, 1888, they staffed what was called St. Mary's Seminary, which has sometimes been referred to as St. Peter's School. They did that right through into the 20th century, well into the 20th century. In 1892, they opened a school in Belmont called a Sacred Heart Academy. I believe that was on the grounds of Belmont Abbey, but Abbot Solari can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then, of course, the other area in which the Sisters of Mercy are well known is that in 1906, they opened Mercy General Hospital. So
And
let's,
I'm going to mention that a bit later and go into detail with that, with a picture.
yeah, we're going to talk about education first, and Joe's going to say some things about Father Mark Gross.
Okay, Father Mark Gross was one of the great missionaries in North Carolina at the time. He was a brother of William, who was Bishop of Savannah and also Bishop of Oregon. Interesting, Oregon, when it was developed almost entirely by Catholics who came down from Canada. Notice that it's not on here, but he is a very reverend Mark Gross. And we think that perhaps he was because he had great favor with his brother, the bishop. So he was a pastor who brought the Mercy Nuns, as Tony mentioned. And he got them from Dublin to staff the school. And it was on that timeline, 1887.
Now, here you see a photograph of the school. This school was at the corner of Stonewall and Tryon, probably around the same site that the gas station had been. Okay, it was in that vicinity. It also served as the convent at that time for the nuns. Now, here's a photograph that we found of children and teachers in front of the school. You have an excellent view of what that school looked like. And apparently on the right-hand side, in the window closest to the doorway, you have Ella and Bessie Springs, who were apparently sisters. We don't know if they were sisters or if they were biological sisters who taught at the school.
We were particularly excited about their names and wanted to get those in there because Ella and Bessie are such great names. And I'm sure they were very common at that time.
Yes. And so this school was originally built in 1888. And the funds for the construction were contributed entirely by Dr. Dennis O'Donoghue, who was a parish member, and the cost of building the school was $18,000. In other words, it was 36 times the cost of just the construction of the church, not including the land. This school was really the true birth of Catholic education in Charlotte. Near the turn of the century, somewhere between 1901 and 1905, St. Mary's Seminary, which again, as I said, was also commonly referred to as St. Peter's School, changed its name to O'Donoghue Hall in honor of the financier of the building of the school. And this is another picture in front of the school with altar boys and apparently the priest who trained them. We have no information about when this picture was taken or who took it or why there are only two of the boys identified, both of whom you can see their names. They're both Italian kids, maybe someone pointing out that not everybody in the parish was Irish at the time. But you have a very interesting and once again clear photographs a photograph of the kinds of activities that were going on through the school in relation to the church. Now, this is, if you look at this souvenir, you can see the date 1905. 1905 was the last year of the school that you see pictured, the last year of that building. And it was, as I said, around this time that it was now commonly referred to as O'Donohue School. And in 1905, O'Donohue Hall was opened. You can see the difference is amazing. And this stood at where the Gantt Museum currently stands, on the corner of Stonewall and Tryon. So it was just down the block from the church.
There's an interesting thing about Dr. O'Donohue. Maybe somebody who's watching and listening this morning would know. We don't know what kind of doctor he was. Some said he was a dentist, others said he was just general country doctor. We just don't know. So there's nothing in any of our files that mentions that and clarifies it.
You can see that he was also president of the St. Vincent de Paul Society. You know, for the longest time, that society existed in virtually every Catholic church in the United States. It was made up only of men, and they were to work with the poor. So when this opened, it served as the school until around 1930, when at least the first part of the current school, which is in Dilworth at St. Patrick's, became O'Donohue School. And now at St. Patrick, it is sometimes called St. Patrick's School and sometimes still called O'Donohue School, depending upon apparently one's preference. This is a photograph taken in front of O'Donohue Hall, the front entrance. And again, you can see that classes were segregated. Okay, they were segregated male and female, and of course they were segregated by race because Black children didn't go to school with white children. Joe's going to talk about the hospital.
Yeah, this is the original Mercy General Hospital. It was on a plot right behind the church. It's where the office building is right now. Important thing about this, and it's parallel with the school system. This was the birth of Catholic healthcare in this whole area. It was originally a parish hall. Of course, it was staffed by the Mercy nuns. And it got so overcrowded at a certain point, I think it was 1916, they moved it to a much bigger facility, which is actually on Vale Avenue now, the Mercy Hospital, which is now part of the system. It was also, interestingly, it was a barracks during World War I. So it's been a multi-purpose facility, which is another exciting part of our history.
By 1884, this abbey had become an independent community, and the first abbot, Leo Haid, was then named Vicar Apostolic of North Carolina. So he was the Catholic bishop for what was the mission territory of the state of North Carolina. It wasn't yet organized into a diocese. And I think it was in 1892, roughly, that the Benedictines began to staff St. Peter's, or shortly before that, as pastors. and started the construction. I think the present church started about 1892 or so. And the connection there also was Father Francis Meyer with Catherine Drexel, who I believe contributed to the construction of St. Peter's, and also through that connection and with Bishop Leo Haid, contributed the majority of the funds for the construction of the Abbey Church here at Belmont.
So we've talked about the role of the Sisters of Mercy. We're now back to the Benedictines, and the Benedictines, who have been connected with St. Peter since 1850 in one form or another, now have officially moved from the old church to the new church. And he mentions the two key people in the early history of the new church.
So here he is, Bishop Leo Haid. I would say that if you said central casting, send me an abbot, that you would get somebody who looks just like this. He's just a fine-looking man who really fills the role wonderfully. He was a Benedictine abbot, of course, and a bishop at the same time. He was born near Latrobe, Pennsylvania, the home of Arnold Palmer. 1859, he was born to German immigrants. He studied at the Benedictine St. Vincent Seminary and was ordained in 1872. That particular seminary was a source of all Benedictines, particularly in the East, for years before and years to come. This is a window which you recognize in our church. It was a gift of Abbot Haid. It was the first, it's actually a very generous thing that he did. You can imagine how expensive it was in those days. And it's the first window on the left side as you enter the church. It's quite beautiful.
Okay, this is another raise your hand opportunity. How many of you know where this tablet is exhibited? Raise your hand if you know where it is. A few of you know where it is, but most of you do not. This tablet is in the narthex of the church, and you can see that the tablet was erected in honor of Francis Meyer, who you heard Abbot Solari talk about. He was the founder of the Knights of Columbus, and he was pastor. You can see he was pastor from 1891 to 1905, so he was there for 14 years. He was the Benedictine who quickly determined earlier that the old church was unsafe and that they needed to build this new church. So he was involved a little earlier in the construction of the church. This terrible photograph is one that we have of Father Francis Meyer. You can see he's a pretty young man. He was 27 years old when he was named the pastor of St. Peter. And this is a picture of him taken, a more formal picture taken of him probably around age 40. And if you think back to the tablet, he only lived to age 41. We'll talk a little bit more about him in relation to some other things. You heard the abbot talk about Sister Catherine Drexel. SBS as Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. This is Catherine Drexel as a attractive young heiress to the Drexel family fortune. She was a devout Catholic, and she, her spiritual advisor was her pastor. His name was Father Joseph O'Connor. And she said, I need to do more. I feel that I can make a contribution. And he said, well, you know, you should work with the poor, and you should bring a group of women together to help you do that. Well, she was a little reluctant. Shortly thereafter, O'Connor becomes bishop, and he calls her in and says, I've thought about this, and I think you need to found an order of nuns, of sisters, whose primary purpose will be to work with the poor, particularly with, as he said at the time, Indians and colored people. And so Catherine Drexel took her inheritance, and she founds the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. This is a picture of her at her desk, and it is very apropos that you see her at a desk with pen in her hand. She was known as a prolific writer. She would write about everything and anything, didn't matter where she was. She was always writing, always taking notes, always reflecting in writing. So she's now used her inheritance to found the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. And her connection to St. Peter Catholic Church, the abbot said that she, may have contributed to construction funds. Actually, those funds were used in adding pews, making sure that there were pews available for, as you see in quotations, colored people at the time. And this was quite a progressive act, if you think about it, in the late 19th, early 20th century. The mission statement of today's Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament is based on the original reason for the order being founded, but it is now guided by the spirit of Catherine Drexel, who is Saint Catherine Drexel. And you can see they put an emphasis on sharing the gospel message, especially among the poor and among minorities, and to combat racism and other injustices as they see. So Catherine Drexel has had not only a major role in the Catholic Church amongst its efforts around poverty, but she did such a significant act for St. Peter that if you've ever wondered who the nun is in the bas-relief on the left-hand side of the altar in church as you're facing the altar, that is Catherine Drexel. This is the first known photograph of St. Peter Catholic Church, probably taken somewhere around the turn of the century. It might have even been taken shortly after the church was opened. Joe's going to talk more about this.
So this is our current church, of course. It was dedicated on Christmas Eve in 1893 by Bishop Leo Haid. We know who he is. The site, of course, is at First Street and South Tryon. First Street is now the Levine Avenue of the Arts. It's brick, Gothic style. Dimensions are 100 by 44 feet. That's about 2.5 times the size of the original church. The ceiling is of steel, it says in the archives. That's hard to believe. I never heard of that. They're generally tin, you would think, at that particular point. It's furnished with American stained glass windows. The The pews, as Tony mentioned, were contributed by Mother Catherine Drexel, now St. Catherine, and some of them reserved for what they called Negro and Indian families who lived in the area. As Tony mentioned, she came from a very wealthy family, and to give you some reference to that, it's the family who established Drexel Burnham, the investment banking firm, and also establishing Drexel University in Philadelphia. And of course, every time I look at that bas-relief, I think of her, particularly because her family estate was on a hill in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. And on top of that hill is where I went to high school, Monsignor Bonner High School. So I have a deep affection for St. Catherine.
This is the rectory, as you recognize. This is the first known photograph of the rectory, which was built in 1897. Joe will tell you some things about the rectory.
Okay. As you know, it's just to the right of the church building. It's the only surviving building among several residences that lined Tryon Street at the turn of the 20th century. And that's just a sad thing. And just imagine what it looked like with residences like this lined up and down on both sides. It was a very charming place. And of course, as in many cases in Charlotte, history's been destroyed. And it housed the priests until the 1880s, when the Jesuits moved to the very chic residence that they have at Ideal Way in Dilworth. And it was subsequently housed later on, after the priests moved, the parish offices. And around 2010, it was named the Ignatius House, is now used for meetings, for spiritual direction, and as a prep area for weddings.
This is the earliest known photograph of the church and the rectory taken together, where we see them together.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because to the just the left of the church, you can see that there were houses along there, and of course that is the lot where the green is. So it gives you an idea of a taste of what things were in perspective at that particular time.
Now, we have been outside, viewing this history from outside, from the land, from construction, from pictures of and drawings of buildings. Now we're going to take you inside. This is, if you were to look on the website or look in the narthex and you saw something labeled a brief history of St. Peter Catholic Church, this was identified as the interior of the original church, the 1851 church. Well, that's incorrect for a number of reasons. One, this is a photograph. It's not a drawing. And we've talked about the infancy of photography at the time and the likelihood that there was no photographer in Charlotte. Secondly, there's evidence that it is the current church because of the windows that you see. These windows are still in the sacristy in the back. So you can see that the sanctuary went right to the back wall at this particular point in time. You may recognize this statue, which is Saint Joseph, and this statue, which is a Madonna of sorts, mother and child, Mary and the infant Jesus. And they are still with us. This painting of, instead of a cross, there was this painting of the crucifixion, which you're going to see staying with St. Peter through a number of years, but not up to the present day. The altar in front here, you can see some glass and some drapery. And this is a piece of the sanctuary that's going to again remain with St. Peter for a good part of its history. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. This kneeler, believe it or not, is still in the sacristy. So you have the first view of the interior of the church. Now, if you look at the date on this document and you look at the picture on the left, which you've seen several times now, and you look at the signature on this document, you see that this document was signed by Leo Haid in 1904, December 2nd, 1904. Now, Joe told you that the church was dedicated on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1893. And 10 years later, we have a document that is essentially, although it's in Latin, and even after 3 years of studying Latin, I still can't read all of it, was a kind of a rededication of St. Peter the Apostle Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. And you can see below that the you can't see all of it there, but Francis Meyer also wrote a portion of this and signed it. And here's a close-up of Haid's signature again, so that you can see and you get a better view of the seal of the bishop. Why? Why was the church rededicated in 1904 when it had only been open 10 years? Because this, which was kind of described as rural German church interior, went from this under the leadership of Francis Meyer to this. 10 years later, this is what the interior of the church looks like. And you're going to see that the more things change, the more they stay the same. There is St. Joseph again, and there is Mary again, and there is the Sacred Heart, which is not around. Here is a statue of St. Anthony, no longer around. This statue, we believe, is a statue of St. Lucy, and I'll tell you why later, because we have a more close-up picture of her. This is the replica of the Peter in the chair that is in Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, and for the longest time was in the narthex of the church, and is now in the vestibule between the sacristy, the garden, and the columbarium. You can see here now, unveiled, this is a representation of the corpus, as it was called when the statue was done in that reclining position of Jesus in the tomb. You notice no center aisles. You notice that the ceiling decorations have been reproduced in the current church. We put this in here more as a curiosity because of the story around this. This was given to the church 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, it arrived with a note saying that this woman found this tome in a folder in a bin of posters at a flea market, and she thought the church might want it. Well, so we included it in that to show that at the time there were these kinds of things given to children. But the other reason we wanted it to be part of this is because here you have the representation of a white Irish Catholic, blue-eyed Jesus. And you'll see at a later time that if you look in the stained glass windows, any of the saints represented in the stained glass windows all have blue eyes.
This is a building right behind the church. Was built as a convent, as now the current St. Peter offices. And this was initiated by Father Ambrose Gallagher, raised funds for this new convent. And it housed the Mercy nuns from all the way from 1923 to 31. Later on, it was used by the USO during World War II. In fact, Bob Hope made several visits there. Just kidding. And it was then used as a day nursery. Subsequently, it became Catholic Charities headquarters before they moved to the offices of the diocese on Carson Boulevard. And finally, the parish offices moved from the old rectory to this rehab building around the year 2000.
And this is again the photograph of the convent right after it was built.
And here are some sisters sitting around a table in the community room. Left to right, Sister M. Margaret, an unknown sister. We have no idea who that is. And then Sister Mary Philomena. She may have been my second grade teacher. Don't know for sure. So this was around 1930. So she would have been very, very young when she doing this, and very, very old, of course, when she taught me. This is one of sisters of various orders around the same building. You see the Mercy nuns in there, and there are others of various other congregations. And we have no idea who some of them are or why they were there. And with them was Bishop McGinnis, who was a bishop at the time, and Father Maurice McDonald, who was the pastor at the time. He was described as a big man, smoking a big cigar, and some said a big mouth.
This is the chapel that was in that convent that you've just been seeing pictures of. And that is still there, because this is what it looks like today. It's the Rice Room, which is a room of meetings, for meetings, spiritual direction, etc., and still has a chapel kind of air to it as well. From now and through the next few minutes, as we come to near the end of this, you're going to be hearing mostly from your fellow sages.
If you want to go back to the beginning, in the 1930s, it was the only Catholic church in Charlotte. That was before St. Patrick's, so I made my first communion here. And I think, Louise, and I'm not sure of my dates, but I think at that time, St. Patrick's was open. It was a mission of St. Peter's, and I went to school at O'Donoghue.
Notice that she said St. Patrick was a mission of St. Peter. The church interior changed again a number of times. This is 1932. This is it in the 40s, pretty much the same, but some changes. no center aisle. Let's hear from Gail again. Whoops, sorry.
St. Peter's has always been a part of my life. One of my biggest memories was standing out in front of the church, and there was a lot going on one Sunday morning, and there was a pink newspaper. They were selling pink newspapers. And I asked my father, I said, Daddy, why is that newspaper pink? And he said, I have no idea. Well, it was Pearl Harbor Day. And that was how we found out about
This is an outdoor mass. It's really interesting. This is a shot of an overflow mass crowd in front of a church in 1942 during the beginning of World War II. What's really interesting is that simultaneously there was a mass going on inside the sanctuary. So many of those attending, and you can see that if you can zero in on it, were troops from a nearby Army camp, Morris Field, which is now at the current Charlotte Airport.
Now, a renovated interior again in 1950. Now, there's a big deal going on here. Why is that? You can see the bishop over here. You can see a whole, here's the bishop, the pastor, the whole group of monsignors, nuns, clergy. Why around 1950 was this done again? Well, St. Peter apparently likes celebrations. Let's hear what was going on.
Well, Edward Biss was originally from Pennsylvania, although actually he was born in Austria, as his parents were on a European trip when it was time for him to be born, but his family lived in Pennsylvania. He entered the community here, I don't remember the exact date, early in the 20th century, and was initially sent to the Benedictine Priory of St. Benedict's in Richmond, which had a parochial school, parish, and a high school, and was active there, but was drawn more and more into pastoral ministry and parish ministry. So he asked to come back to North Carolina and went initially, I believe it was, to Winston-Salem, to St. Leo Parish, and then from there in 1949 to Charlotte, where, at least from all that I've heard, he was a much loved and popular pastor at St. Peter.
So he was pastor around 1950-51, and here he is. Joe's going to tell you a little bit about him.
Okay, so he was the final Benedictine pastor, and he, of course, was the one that Biss Hall was named after. And he served for a long time, longer than any other pastor had done, or has done since, all the way from 1949 to 69. He had many accomplishments over those years, raised money for redecoration of the church, built up the church organizations, Holy Name Society, altar societies, youth groups, and he led the centennial celebration in 1951. And here's a letter that was part of a folder, a brochure at the head of this, which then went into the history of St. Peter, and a place where we got a lot of our materials. So this was the centennial celebration.
Right. And so when you saw that photograph of all the dignitaries, that was the celebration of the centennial of St. Peter Church, 1851-1951.
And I've walked through this church now and look at the stained glass windows. I remember those names so well when I first came. That was the history of St. Peter's. There's O'Donoghue, there's Meyer. There was one other name I can't remember. And I noticed a lot of these stained glass windows are given by women. So that makes me feel very good. And so we have, but just remembering those names from way back is amazing. And it's in our connection to the churches, we're loyal parishioners, I would say.
One of the exceptions to the woman relationship was Abbot Haid, who was the abbot at
Right.
Belmont Abbey. And of course, the Benedictines founded the St. Peter's back in.
And that's the first window up there, stained glass
Yes,
window.
right.
Mhm, mhm, in
And
his honor.
the course of the Benedictines, and I remember them very well, this was a Benedictine church for most of my early lifetime. And I went here then when St. Patrick was built. I grew up in Dilworth, so it became my home parish, St. Patrick's. So I went there more frequently as in elementary school and in junior high school, I should say. But off and on down through the years, I always came back to St. Peter's.
So there you see a full shot of the church at the after the redecoration and rededication of the centennial. Still no center aisle. This is the first color photograph that we found. We don't know the year, although it's in the 50s, but we do know that it's Good Friday. And the reason we know it's Good Friday is that this is unveiled. The altar has been stripped. Statues, you'll remember, used to be covered, and the tabernacle is open and empty. In the 70s, this is the first photo we found of the church with a center aisle. And this is in the 70s. Also, it's taken at Christmas time, and it is the changes this time to the interior of the church, the sanctuary, driven entirely by liturgical requirements. These are the changes required after Vatican II.
It's a funny thing. We talk about the history of St. Patrick's as though it was more as if it may have been as important as the history of St. Peter's. Well, the history of St. Peter's was the first Catholic church. No, not the first Catholic church in North Carolina, but was one of the first. And it has been, particularly since the Jesuits arrived, and even and before as well, it has been a home for Catholicism.
We talked about dark periods. This is the
Yeah.
second dark period.
Well, let me talk about this, and I'm going to abbreviate this because we're really running out of time. So during this period, the church served very few people, not even priests. Priests were administrators, not pastors, and their various priests were here. The final one was Father Michael O'Keefe, who took over as the final pastor as a church of convenience in 1978. He attended much needed repair, so they tried to keep things going. We understand, I saw a picture of him, but we don't have it in here, that he was kind of a grouchy guy. And I looked at a picture and he really looks amazingly like Senator Joe McCarthy. A very sad part of this is that in May 83, the 12:10 Mass was discontinued. The following year, the Sunday Mass was discontinued. And in 1985, there were no Lenten services.
And one of the priests assigned during that time later was identified in the sex abuse scandal.
The parish there, and I think it may have been for the centennial of the present church, invited our community, and we came as a community for Mass and reception there in the 1990s. to recognize that connection. That was very gracious for the Jesuits at that time to recognize the role of the Benedictines in really establishing the Catholic Church in Western North Carolina. And that was also a delightful celebration. Abbot Oscar Burnett was the abbot at the time, and he presided at the Mass. But we came to that at the invitation of the parish and the Jesuit community as a community to celebrate that. And that's a particularly nice memory.
So he's talking about a second centennial celebration. This one, the centennial of the current church. So we have a centennial of the founding of the parish and a centennial celebration of the current church. This is what the sanctuary looked like within 3 years of the Jesuits coming. We'll talk more about this in another presentation. Let's hear about an 83-year love affair.
My father was transferred from New York City to Charlotte with the Associated Press, which was located in primarily an Charlotte Observer building, which is exactly 1 block away from St. Peter's. So obviously my family brought me here as a 5-year-old, and so it's been an 83-year love affair.
And I probably didn't come until 1953. I was a senior in high school, and my mother and sister and I belonged to Assumption, actually. And so, but we were always looking for a church that we could identify with or enjoy, and maybe it was because of church times.
This is the current sanctuary. We'll talk more about that in another presentation. And this is the COVID-19 sanctuary. Could also be called the Zoom sanctuary, because other than the gentleman at the left of the picture, this is all you see if you watch Mass now through Zoom or YouTube or website or whatever. We're going to finish with a short reflection by Father Jim Shea, our pastor, who'll talk about a couple of things that we mentioned in the beginning relating to sharing our wisdom.
If you want to live richly, this seems to be what makes sense. And you can't do that as a young person, but as an older person, you have years and years of knowing that as much as we mess it up, God is always faithful. And that long sense of, God is rich in mercy. And that's what an older person can preach to, because we're all, life is pretty challenging and it can be pretty hard. And the older we get, the more we accept that. The more we have to accept that, and that none of us escape. And yet we're happier now than we were when we were 30. We wouldn't go back. So I think that's what's the bottom line? God is rich in mercy. You are loved, you are chosen, and God is faithful. And that's what I try to do is even though sometimes the bottom line is we need, Pope Francis said to the Jesuits gathered in Rome a while back, your task is to, the core of your task is to encourage God's faithful people. Encourage God's faithful people and to help them with discernment. Help them, in other words, help them recognize God in the storm, so that the evil one doesn't rob them of their joy. And so isn't that a great privilege to do that, at this point in my life, rather than work on my golf game. So there's a great sense of gratitude and privilege.
And we are done. We hope that this was an informative event for you. We want to thank the people who are listed on the screen. And we want to part the curtains so that you will see that coming soon is a History of St. Peter Catholic Church Part 2, tentatively named The Jesuits, the Arts, and St. Peter Parish. And now I believe it goes back to Louise.
Tony and Joe, fabulous job. What a wonderful legacy for St. Peter's to have this for posterity. Thanks everyone for joining us. I thought it was just a wonderful program myself. And remember to look forward to the spring program right here on the screen, History of St. Peter Part 2. We'll have more about that coming soon. So as we conclude, let us say, glory be to the Father and
Son,
to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is
Yes.
now and ever shall be, world without end.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much.